Lost Islamic History audiobook by Firas-Alkhateeb Chapter 8. The Edge. Far too often, the Muslim world is thought of as the Middle East and nothing beyond it. Islam of course began in the Arabian Peninsula and saw its greatest empires rise in the region between the Nile and Oxus rivers. But by only focusing on this region, some of the richest history of the Muslim world is neglected. It is in the furthest reaches of Islam, in sub-Saharan Africa, China and in Southeast Asia that the relationship between Islam and the rest of the world can be seen in all its complexity. West Africa. When Islam arrived in North Africa in the decades after the death of the Prophet, it generally clung to the coast. Much like the Romans and Byzantines before them, the Muslims chose to settle in cities along the Mediterranean coastline for practical reasons, including the connection to Mediterranean shipping and the fact that further inland the Sahara Desert prevented any major settled civilizations from thriving. The civilization that flourished in North African cities such as Kairouan, Tripoli and Tangier was a mix of Arab and Berber influences, brought together under the banner of Islam and closely connected to Muslim civilizations in the Middle East and Al-Andalus. From this urban hub along the Mediterranean coast, Islam slowly began to diffuse southward across the Sahara Desert. In West Africa, the landscape is dominated by the Savannah and the Niger River. Sustainable settled communities are difficult in the rolling grasslands that evolve into the Sahara Desert north of the river, as well as in the dense forests to the south. As a result, most West African kingdoms, before and after the arrival of Islam, tended to cluster around the Niger River, particularly the inland delta that provided rich farmland. A nomadic group of Muslim Berbers, the Tuareg, dominated the trade routes that led from North African cities, across the desert wasteland, and into the West African savanna. The kingdoms that developed in this region relied heavily on the trans-Sahara trade, which provided a market for their goods, chiefly gold and salt. That same trade brought more than just wealth to West Africa, it also brought Islam. Muslim merchants who made the trek across the desert began to settle in West Africa, and by the 11th century, immigrant Muslim communities could be found in many cities and towns across the savannah. Since the bulk of the Muslims in West Africa were businessmen and not missionaries, Islam spread slowly among the local populations. West Africans would commonly convert to Islam and yet hold on to pre-Islamic beliefs in spirits and sorcerers for generations. Unlike in North Africa, where Islam came in as a strong political force all at once, Islam in West Africa slowly diffused into the local culture, accepting new Muslims without requiring them to adhere to all Islamic beliefs immediately. The only exception to this was the Murbitun movement, which managed to conquer land in West Africa for a brief decade in the 11th century, but doesn't seem to have had a lasting impact. The first native Muslim kingdom of West Africa was Mali. It was founded in the 1200s by the mythical character Sundita Keita, a partially Islamized ruler of the Mandinka people. Nicknamed the Lion King, he was said to have been exiled by an evil ruler, rallied support among the Mandinka people while in exile, came back to take his rightful throne, and took the title Mansa. Mandinka for King of Kings. The details of the story have probably been blurred through generations of oral storytellers. But what is known for sure is that the empire that Sundita founded in West Africa in the inner Niger Delta region soon grew to be one of the wealthiest and most powerful states of the age. The wealth of Mali is best seen in the reign of Mansa Musa, who ruled from 1312 to 1337. After taking power when his brother, the former Mansa, sailed west across the Atlantic in search of new lands, Mansa Musa took hold of what was probably one of the wealthiest and most powerful Muslim empires of the day. While the Middle East was dealing with the consequences of the Mongol invasion and Al-Andalus was reduced to the Emirate of Granada, Mali rose in the savannah south of the Sahara Desert to become the premier Muslim political entity. Yet it was far away from the eyes of the rest of the Muslim world, which was relatively unaware of this distant Muslim state. Most of what we know about Mali from this time comes from accounts of Mansa Musa's epic 1324 Hajj to Mecca, which served to showcase Mali's wealth and power to the rest of the Muslim world. Mansa Musa's Hajj caravan departed the West Africa savannah with an entourage of over 60,000 people. The king was accompanied by 12,000, each dressed in valuable silk robes and carrying 2 kilograms of gold extracted from Mali's famous gold mines. Camels also carried bags of gold dust, which was distributed to the poor along the route. Numerous towns and cities along the route marveled at the grand procession coming from the unknown West African kingdom. When Mansa Musa reached Egypt, which was then ruled by the Mamluk dynasty, Mansa Musa left quite an impression on the local Mamluk officials. They recorded that he was exceptionally devout, never missing a prayer, and with a mastery of the Quran. In Egypt, Musa was said to have given out so much gold to the city's locals that unintended inflation wrecked the economy. And when the famous North African traveler Bin Battuta visited Egypt 10 years later, he noticed that the local economy had still not recovered from the giant influx of the valuable metal. Perhaps more remarkable than his journey to Mecca was Mansa Musa's return to Mali. Given that Mali was still in the middle of a long process of Islamization and local indigenous beliefs still mixed with Islamic orthodoxy, Mansa Musa saw a need for more qualified Islamic scholarship. Using his considerable wealth as a tool for the advancement of Mali, he paid for some of the best scholars, teachers and artists to accompany him back to West Africa. Arabs, Persians and Andalusians all came to Mali with Mansa Musa in the 1320s, creating an African society with clear influences from the rest of the Muslim world. Furthermore, the huge influx of scholars helped catapult Mali to the forefront of knowledge. Half a century after the Mongol disaster that destroyed Baghdad's House of Wisdom, a new hub of scholarship arose in the West African savannah. In the early 1400s, a scholar of fiqh from the Hijaz, Abd ar-Rahman al-Tamimi, traveled to Timbuktu only to realize that the level of scholarship was so high there that he would have to go to Fez first to take prerequisite courses before he could study with Mali's scholars. The center of Mali's knowledge was Timbuktu. About 20 kilometers north of the Niger River, Timbuktu lies on the edge of the Sahara Desert and was a major stop along the Trans-Sahara trade. It came under Mali's control during the reign of Mansa Musa and immediately benefited from his importation of scholars. Libraries, mosques, and universities sprung up all over Timbuktu, giving the city a distinctly Islamic character. One of the people Musa brought back with him to Mali, the Andalusian architect Abu Ishq, was commissioned by the sovereign to build palaces, mosques and schools throughout Timbuktu in the hope that it could rival other, older urban Islamic centers. Musa also sent scholars from Mali north to the more established educational institutes in Morocco to be educated in advanced concepts in Islam so that they could come back and serve the Malian community in Timbuktu. Both Mali and the Songhai Empire, which replaced Mali in the late 1400s, granted special benefits to Islamic scholars, commonly giving them tracts of land and charters of privilege. Through the importation of scholars from the Arab world and the intellectual growth of the native African community of Timbuktu, it became one of the leading centers of Islamic knowledge in the world at a time when Muslim civilization was on the decline in its traditional centers. East Africa. The East African coast did not have to wait long to be exposed to Islam. Before Muhammad undertook his hijrah to Medina, a group of his companions escaped Meccan persecution and settled in Aksum for a few years, where a Christian king welcomed them. Immigration also went in the opposite direction, and Bilal, a companion of the Prophet who would commonly recite the call to prayer in Medina, was a former slave from Ethiopia. This was not strange considering that before Islam arrived in the 7th century, trade links between the East African coast and the Arabian Peninsula already existed. As had occurred in West Africa, it was through trade routes that Islam would spread along the Indian Ocean coast of Africa. In the early 19th century, a Muslim slave in America, Bilali Muhammad, wrote a 13-page manuscript about Islamic law based on West Africa's educational curriculum to teach fellow slaves on his plantation. Merchants from the Arabian Peninsula, In particular, the region of Hadramaut in Yemen began to settle in cities along the East African coast in the centuries following Yemen's conversion to Islam. The earliest artifacts attesting to Islam's presence in East Africa date from the late 700s and early 800s. Evidence shows that Islam was incorporated into East African life first in the northernmost parts of the coast, which were nearest to Arabia. Mosques dating from the 10th century have been excavated in Kenya, about 2,500 kilometers south of the birthplace of Islam. By the 13th century, Islam had taken root even further along the coast in what is now Tanzania. The main avenue through which Islam spread in East Africa was commerce. As a rich Indian Ocean trade developed, East African city-states welcomed Muslim merchants. It was through these areas that Islam diffused into the coastal region. The pattern of conversion along the coast is unique in the Muslim world. East Africa was distant enough that no large-scale population movements occurred, yet accessible enough that a sizable number of traders were able to regularly visit the coast, and in some cases permanently relocate. Wealthy merchants who settled in the cities along the coast intermarried with local African women, assimilating into the local culture, but with the addition of Islam. These were not settler communities of Arabs and Persians who dominated the local Africans. This was a genuine intermixing of cultures that led to the development of a new hybrid culture, with Islam at its heart. Swahili, a Bantu language native to East Africa, became the lingua franca of the coastal region as merchants traveled from city to city, tying the region together culturally and linguistically. Because of visiting Arab merchants, Swahili adopted many Arabic loanwords, but at its core, it remained a native African language. Similarly, Africans in the port cities adopted aspects of Arab and Persian culture. As has been seen in all parts of the world that adopted Islam, the arrival of the new religion did not mean the elimination of the previous culture and traditions. As the local populations adopted Islam, powerful Muslim trading states developed along the Swahili coast. The most reliable information about them comes from the same Ibn Battuta who visited West Africa in the 14th century. According to him, these city-states along the coast were not just commercial centers, but also religious ones. Ibn Battuta comments that the Sultan of Mogadishu would rely on his religious advisors, the chief of whom was brought from Egypt, in the day-to-day affairs of his state. In Kilwa and Mombasa, he remarks about the religious zeal of their peoples and the large, well-kept mosques in those cities. He is especially praiseful of the Sultan of Kilwa, who would give special treatment to religious scholars and descendants of the Prophet, and regularly ate meals with the city's poor. Besides anecdotes about the Islamic character of the East African coast, it is important to recognize the assimilation of Islam into the lives of the Swahili. Islam was not seen as an outsider religion imposed on the local Africans by Arab and Persian immigrants. Islam was seen as a native African religion. Stories of the African companion of the Prophet, Bilal, and the presence of Muslim refugees in Abyssinia were important to the locals as they created a sense of identity that was entirely Islamic and entirely African. There were external cultural influences, chiefly from southern Arabia, Persia and India, brought by traders from those regions. But much like other parts of the Muslim world, a culture developed that was based on the pre-Islamic character of the region, modified to fit in with Islamic law, but not absent of influences from the variety of peoples, all tied together by common faith. African slavery and the Americas. The Islamization of Africa would lead to the eventual spread of Islam across the Atlantic Ocean in North and South America. Once the era of European colonization of the New World began with Columbus' voyage across the Atlantic in 1492, a pressing need for labor developed in Europe's American colonies. The original plan of enslaving Native Americans proved inefficient. Native Americans were decimated by European-introduced diseases and died by the millions in the early decades of the 1500s. European colonists looking for a better solution looked south to sub-Saharan Africa and its black population for slave labor. European slave traders arrived at ports along the West African coast looking to buy slaves by the hundreds. They dealt with local African kings who would capture fellow Africans in war and sell them to the Europeans in exchange for more weapons that could be used to capture more slaves. This destructive cycle led to the complete political destruction of the region and the depopulation of large areas of West and Central Africa, whose peoples were forcibly taken across the Atlantic in inhuman conditions to work as slaves in the New World. Of course, large parts of Black Africa had accepted Islam by the 1500s, and a significant number of the slaves taken to America were Muslims. Estimates vary, but of the 15-20 million Africans brought to America through the slave trade, between 3 and 6 million may have been Muslims. Their experience in America was one of humiliation and subjugation to European colonists. There were usually no laws regulating how slaves could be treated, so slave owners were free to beat, abuse or kill their slaves however they saw fit. Slaves generally worked on plantations in the American South, the Caribbean and South America, unprotected from the elements and forced to work long hours. Whippings and other forms of torture were common punishment for slaves who did not work up the expectations of the owners or defied orders. Furthering the humiliation of the slave population, it was not uncommon for a slave to be given just one set of coarse, tattered clothing, or even be forced to work entirely naked. While all slaves suffered at the hands of slave owners who refused to see them as equals, Muslim slaves experienced unique difficulties. Breaking from work 5 times a day for prayer was rarely possible, and traveling to Mecca to perform the Hajj was totally out of the question. Furthermore, avenues to learn more about Islam were few. Some slaves who already had the Quran memorized before their captivity were able to revise their memorization and teach some parts of the Quran to others. But no educational institutions existed which could help preserve the Islamic tradition. Thus, as the generations went on during the 16th through 19th centuries, the knowledge of Islam among Muslim slaves and their descendants slowly decreased. Attempts to secure imported Qurans from Europe, bought with money made doing extra work, helped slow the decline of Islamic knowledge. But it was no substitute for the great centers of Islamic learning of West Africa. In the 1800s in Rio de Janeiro, there was such a high demand from Muslim slaves in Brazil for Arabic Qurans that one bookseller imported over 100 Qurans per year to sell to the local slaves. The slaves would spend years doing extra work to pay for them. African Muslim slaves also had benefits that other slaves did not. Unique among the slave population in the Americas, Muslim slaves tended to be very well educated, in some cases more so than their owners. The tradition of emphasis on education among Muslims in general and in West Africa specifically led to a class of Muslim slaves in the Americas who were literate, unlike most non-Muslim slaves and even Europeans. While in some cases their higher level of education gave Muslim slaves the opportunity to do less demanding work such as accounting and management for plantations, it also gave them the ability to organize and lead revolts. A notable example occurred in the Brazilian state of Bahia in 1835. Muslim scholars who had been taken to Brazil as slaves used their knowledge and positions of leadership in the sizable Muslim community of Salvador to plan an organized rebellion against their masters. Notes written in Arabic were passed among slaves, detailing the plan and its objectives. The revolt, which involved about 300 slaves, ended up being unsuccessful as Brazilian soldiers brutally put down the activities of the Muslim slaves. But it did instill enough fear of Muslim slaves among Brazilians that many Muslims throughout Brazil were sent back to Africa in hopes of avoiding another revolt. The centuries of servitude inflicted on Muslim slaves in the Americas was not without consequence. Throughout Islamic history, regions distant from the Arabian Peninsula almost always had some kind of intellectual or economic connection with the birthplace and central areas of Islam. For Muslims in the Americas before the modern era, however, being so far removed from the rest of Muslim world geographically and intellectually meant the eventual disintegration of that Muslim community. Each successive generation inherited less and less of the original Islamic knowledge and practice that the first generation slaves had. In the United States, by the mid-1800s, there were almost no Muslims left who had knowledge of Islam, and by the 1900s, only a few grandchildren of slaves could recall their ancestors practicing foreign rites different from the mainstream Christianity of most African Americans. A revival of the memory of Islam among the descendants of slaves came about in the 20th century, however. The Nation of Islam, a syncretic religion bringing together Christian and Islamic rites and beliefs, formed as a racial religious organization aimed at the advancement of America's black community. By the 1960s, however, former Nation of Islam members such as Malcolm X and W.D. Muhammad led thousands of African Americans away from the nation and back to a more mainstream understanding of Islam, one that had been slowly erased from the lives of their ancestors centuries earlier. China. After the establishment of Islam during the 600s and 700s in the region that stretched from Spain to India, various cultures beyond the borders of the Islamic Empire slowly adopted Islam and eventually became Muslim-majority regions. Examples include East and West Africa, Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Islam also slowly spread into China at around the same time. Unlike those other regions, however, China never wholly adopted Islam, and the Muslim community remained a minority. Despite this, Muslims played an integral part in Chinese history for centuries. Islam's origins date back to the Caliphate of Uthman Affan, who sent another early convert to Islam, Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, as an ambassador to the Tang dynasty of China around the year 650. Muslims were capable of reaching out to the distant Far East just decades after Muhammad led the meteoric rise of the religion in the 600s. But it was not until the 700s when a permanent Muslim presence was felt in China. It was in the 750s when Muslim soldiers were invited by the Tang government to serve in the Chinese military. Groups of Muslim warriors made the trek to China and joined the military and bureaucratic structure of the Chinese government. Encouraged to intermarry with local women and settle permanently in Chinese cities, Muslims found a stable and prosperous role in Chinese society. Government and military work soon became the niche that Muslims occupied. Muslim pursuit of careers in those fields continues in China to this day. Despite their role in the upper echelons of Chinese society, there remained many barriers between Muslims in China and native Chinese people. The Eastern religions popular in China, namely Buddhism and Confucianism, are a world apart from Islam. While Muslims in Christian areas further west in the Muslim world could relate to others through a shared history about Abraham, Moses and Jesus, the Muslims in China had no such luxury. Thus, Muslim communities tended to be separated from mainstream society. Special enclaves developed that kept Muslims apart from other Chinese. But they also served as portals of Islamic knowledge that connected Chinese Muslims with their distant co-religionists in the Arab and Persian lands. Through such isolated communities, in the midst of Chinese cities, Muslims were able to retain their Islamic identity and practices even thousands of kilometers away from the rest of the Muslim world. But that isolation would end during the Mongol conquests of the 13th century. The Mongols' vast empire included Muslim lands in Central Asia and Persia along with China. The destruction of entire cities and regions in the Middle East meant the whole-scale movement of populations. With political unity linking the heartland of the Muslim world with Muslim communities in China, a new avenue for contact between the two regions opened up. Furthermore, mass migrations by Muslims into China meant a huge boost to the Chinese Muslim population. Just as important was the Mongol policy of assimilating Muslims into mainstream Chinese culture. Muslim communities no longer served as isolated enclaves surrounded by non-Muslims. They were instead encouraged to take on more public roles in society, and were especially useful as administrators in a Mongol empire that encompassed Muslims in its eastern and western ends. In the 1300s, the Hongwu Emperor wrote the 100-word eulogy, which praised the characteristics of the Prophet Muhammad. Copies of it were distributed to mosques throughout China. During Mongol rule over China and the succeeding Ming dynasty, Chinese Muslims became fully assimilated into Chinese culture. They were no longer seen as foreigners, but rather as Chinese countrymen with their own identity, Hui. The Hui were no different from the Ha, China's majority ethnic group, other than when it came to religious identity. Finally considered to be fully a part of Chinese society after living in the country for hundreds of years, Muslims in Ming China were able to assimilate into the local culture, adopting Chinese customs and even names, all the while continuing their tradition of serving the imperial government as civil servants and military leaders. It was during this time that perhaps the most famous Chinese Muslim, Zheng He, 1371-1433, became one of China's greatest explorers. A Hui from the Yunnan region in the south, Zheng He was favored by the Ming government and was given command of a fleet of treasure ships. Commanding hundreds of ships, some large enough to carry all three of Columbus' ships alone, and tens of thousands of sailors. He was given the responsibility of trading with distant lands and establishing diplomatic relations between them and Ming China. His voyages touched dozens of modern-day countries throughout Asia, the Middle East and even Africa, but he is perhaps most fondly remembered in Southeast Asia, where he is revered as a figure who helped spread Islam in the Malay archipelago. Mosques throughout the region are named after the famed admiral, known locally as Cheng Ho. But Zheng He managed to cross over from being just a notable Muslim figure to one who is celebrated among non-Muslim Chinese as their nation's greatest explorer. Zheng He is emblematic of the nature of Islam in China, fully Chinese yet fully Muslim with no contradiction between the two identities. India. After Muhammad Qasim's expedition into the Indus River Valley in the early 700s, Islam did not penetrate much further politically into the Indian subcontinent. A foothold was established in Sindh, but due to its distance from the Muslim capital at Damascus and then Baghdad, further military expeditions were impractical and probably financially untenable. The arrival of the Turks in the Muslim world pushed Muslim power further into India. Of particular note is Mahmud of Ghazni, 997-1030, a Turkic sultan who was the first to lead military expeditions deep into India. By establishing himself as the leader of an autonomous state based in Ghazni in the Afghan highlands, he was close enough to India to focus much of his attention on the subcontinent. His 17 military campaigns into northern India served as the basis of his rule, bringing wealth and power to him and his empire. While his raids were no doubt detrimental to local power and rule in India, he also established major cultural centers and helped spread Persian culture throughout his reign. The legendary Persian poet Firdausi, who perhaps did more to revive ancient Persian culture than any other person after the country's conversion to Islam, and Al-Biruni, a scientist, historian, geologist and physicist, were both mainstays of Mahmud's court. Because of his status as a patron of the arts coupled with his ruthless raids into India, Mahmud of Ghazni's legacy in India today is colored by modern politics as much as anyone else. In addition to his scientific discoveries, Al-Biruni wrote volumes on Indian history and society. Translations of his History of India served as the main source of knowledge about India in medieval Europe. Regardless of his legacy, Mahmud and the Ghaznavid dynasty he founded laid the foundation for Muslim conquest in India. The succeeding dynasty, the Ghurids, also ruled out of Afghanistan and managed to push their borders even further into India, capturing Delhi in 1192. The Ghurids relied on slave soldiers of Turkic origin who formed the core of their army, much like the contemporary Ayyubids further west in the Muslim world. Like their counterparts in Egypt, who established the Mamluk Sultanate, the slave soldiers in India eventually overthrew their masters and inaugurated their own dynasty, the Delhi Sultanate. The Delhi Sultanate ruled over parts of India from 1206 until the arrival of the Mughals in 1526. 5 separate slave dynasties, the Mamluk, Khilji, Tughlaq, Sayyid and Lodhi ruled from Delhi during the Sultanate's 3 centuries. The exact political successions and conflicts are not vital enough to mention in detail, but there are important political trends that characterize the Delhi Sultanate. Firstly, the Sultanate was ruled as a Turkic slave dynasty, not unlike the Mamluks of Egypt. Power was rarely passed down from father to son. Instead, when a sultan died, a new general would be elected by notables of the empire to take his place. A sultan could even be recalled and removed from power by his subordinates if he failed to fulfill his duties as head of state. This allowed the sultanate to stave off the culture of complacency that plagues many hereditary dynasties after the first few generations. Furthermore, the vast majority of Delhi's sultans did not claim the title of caliph. They recognized the ultimate authority of the Abbasids as leaders of the Muslim world and saw themselves as subjects. Even after the destruction of Baghdad and the relegation of the Abbasids to nominal figureheads in Cairo, the Delhi Sultanate regularly sent emissaries to the Caliph seeking his approval and permission to rule under his authority. Despite being separated by thousands of kilometers and the high Himalayan and Hindu Kush mountain ranges, the Delhi Sultanate attempted to keep India tied together with the rest of the Muslim world, at least by name. The Delhi Sultanate era is also notable for the spread of Islam within its domains. Islam had of course been present in India since the early 600s when Arab merchants appeared in trading ports along the Indian Ocean coast. But it would take patronage from a Muslim political entity to truly spread Islam inland among a large portion of the Indian population. The Delhi Sultanate provided that opportunity. Sufi orders enjoyed royal sponsorship and were able to travel throughout India preaching to all social classes of people. Sufism, with its spiritual focus, found fertile ground in the subcontinent, where a polytheistic native population would have trouble accepting the strict monotheism of Islam without an inward spiritual dimension. Itinerant scholars, many of whom came directly from Arab and Persian lands, preached spiritual fulfillment and a new connection with God which helped them gain huge followings during their travels. Furthermore, the egalitarian nature of Islam, exemplified best by the Prophet when he declared all believers are equal before the eyes of God, offered an escape from Hinduism's caste system, known for its rigidity and inequality. Exact numbers are impossible to come by, but through the calm preaching of wandering missionaries and the continued Indian Ocean trade that brought merchants to areas such as Gujarat and Bengal, Islam managed to find a solid foothold in Indian society throughout much of the subcontinent, even though the Muslim population never outnumbered the Hindu. Southeast Asia. The influence of traveling merchants and preachers in converting a local population was magnified further east in the Malay archipelago. This region had long served as the crossroads of trade, connecting merchants based in India with those based in China. The Chinese, with their fixed bureaucracy and imperial traditions, were less capable of spreading their own culture and government ideas in the archipelago than the more flexible Indians. Thus, before the turn of the first millennium, Buddhism and Hinduism, exported from India, held major sway in Southeast Asia. The Buddhist Srivijaya Empire, based on the island of Sumatra, and the Maiden Kingdom based on Java, were among the numerous kingdoms that spread Indian influence in the region. But once Islam had established itself among India's coastal communities, the opportunity arose for merchants and preachers based in India to spread a new Islamic influence in Southeast Asia. Once again, commerce played a major role in the spread of Islam in a land far away from the Arabian deserts where Islam was born. Conversion to Islam was attractive to local kings partly because of the economic opportunities it presented. Islam provided the glue that held together an Indian Ocean trade that spanned from East African city-states to Arabia to coastal India. Shared beliefs and Arabic as a lingua franca facilitated trade between regions that would otherwise not have much in common. If a king in Southeast Asia converted to Islam, he could also join this lucrative economic community. Once local rulers in the archipelago began to convert to Islam around the 1100s, powerful Muslim empires arose in the region, built on the economic opportunities that Islam brought. It was through these rulers that Islam began to spread among the local population of the Malay archipelago. Traditional stories in the region commonly state that a king was the first to accept Islam, followed by his close advisors and family, and that Islam would trickle down into society from the top. These kings probably provided the opportunity for missionaries from further west, many of whom preached Islam through Sufism, to come and spread their beliefs among the locals, spreading Islam in much the same way as the Delhi Sultanate. A notable difference is that, while in northern India there was a heavy Persian element to the spread of Islam, in Southeast Asia the missionaries tended to come from the Indian Ocean rim, particularly Yemen. Thus, the school of fiqh that became most prominent in East Africa, coastal India and Southeast Asia was that of Imam al-Shafi'i. Due to Yemen being a center for Shafi'i learning as well as a key hub in the Indian Ocean trade. Northern India, on the other hand, was more influenced by the Hanafi school which was popular in Persia and Central Asia. The Muslim kingdoms that arose during and after the Islamization of Southeast Asia were tied in with the rest of the Muslim world through the Indian Ocean trade network.